This episode is brought to you by the Davidson Institute at davidsongifted.org. The Davidson Institute offers programs, resources, scholarships, and opportunities for profoundly gifted young learners that are driven by their natural talent and abilities.
Nothing really prepares you for your 3 or 4-year-old coming down the stairs at 11:30 at night, unable to sleep, crying, distraught because they can't stop thinking about what's real and what might not be real. And it could be anything. Like, if you watch Cosmos, there are things in there that put ideas in kids' heads that they'll dwell on, like parallel universes or the concept of, am I living in a matrix kind of thing.
In the landscape of giftedness, profoundly gifted is a term that might mystify even seasoned educators and clinicians. What does it truly entail to navigate the world when your cognitive abilities soar beyond the ordinary? Today, we're unraveling the complexities of the profoundly gifted mind with Blake Haygood. Blake is a gifted coordinator in the Austin Independent School District and a parent to a profoundly gifted child. That's straight ahead on episode 197. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
Quick note, Dave and I are headed to the National Association for Gifted Children conference next week. So if you are going to be there, be sure to drop by one of my sessions or swing by our booth in the exhibit hall to say hello. I always love meeting and talking to our listeners. Hope to see you there. The music you are hearing now was composed by Clark Haygood when he was 7 years old. He's the child of our guest, Blake Haygood, and our conversation is up next.
Previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Even though there is a real tendency for neurodivergent people to feel attracted to other neurodivergent folks and neurotypicals to other neurotypicals, I think there is often these really beautiful attractions that form between two different neurotypes, including within my own marriage. I have lived experience with that too, where there can be ways in which your different brains really create some spark and some interest and some excitement in your relationship. Kind of paradoxically, we actually can feel safe with people whose brains work really differently than our own. Sometimes we find a different kind of acceptance or a different quality of acceptance. It's hard to articulate, but I definitely see it and experience it, and there's something really lovely.
That's episode 188. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Today, we're welcoming Blake Haygood to the podcast. Blake works in the Austin Independent School District, where he is the gifted coordinator. He is also parent to a profoundly gifted child. So, Blake, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
To start us off today, I think it would be helpful to have a conversation about what it means to be profoundly gifted, because I think even for people who are perhaps clinicians or educators in the field, they may not really know what that means or what it really looks like. So can you talk to us a little bit just about what profound giftedness is?
Absolutely. So I've done research on this before, and I wanted to do a little bit more before meeting with you, but I checked state education agencies. I'm still not seeing any mention of profoundly gifted children. A handful of states do mention highly gifted students. Texas, for example, says that they have special needs, like twice exceptional, emergent bilingual students. And that's the only mention of them they have in the state plan. The Davidson Institute does have profoundly gifted set past the 145 to 160 IQ range. So there is some data out there, but not in state or government agency form. In other research, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children with Extended Norms has profoundly gifted at 175 and up. So there's not even consensus really on where PG is. In my experience, students around or above like the second standard deviation tend to get identified for GT services, and that'd be an IQ of around 130 and up. And the WISC with the extended norms has highly gifted at the third standard deviation, So that's 145 to 160. The fourth standard deviation, 160 to 175, is considered exceptionally gifted. And then beyond that, like I said, is profoundly gifted. But most tests that we use to assess ability in public schools don't evaluate beyond the third standard deviation of 160. Mm-hmm. When Clark was in kindergarten, for example, he took the NNAT-3, the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test, and that stops at 160. So most tests in public school, like the TAGT is the same, it's 160, don't assess kids at that level.
I was kind of looking at some statistics as well. So out of 10,000 people, it says about 13 might have a measured cognitive ability over 154 was where I pulled this from specifically. So we're looking at 0.13% of the population. Mm-hmm. How does it look different from a student who is, I know some school districts have a cutoff score for a gifted ed program at like 125, which is I think the 95th percentile. A 130 is the 98th percentile. So kids who might qualify for a gifted program versus some of those other bands within that range.
It really comes down to me to be asynchrony. The NAGC describes the mismatch between cognitive, emotional, and physical development in a child. And for PG kids, it's a more pronounced asynchrony. Just for example, where a general education student may take 20 passes to master the content, a gifted child might take 6. And where a gifted child took 6 passes, the profoundly gifted child took 1 pass, or maybe 2 if I taught it badly. So when we look at giftedness through the lens of asynchrony, it's really obvious how vital it is that gifted services are happening. They benefit from enrichment, extension, and acceleration because they've already mastered the content and would otherwise just be sitting there.
Having worked as an educator in gifted and talented programs, you know what giftedness might look like in kids. What was it about your child's development that made you think that there was maybe something different about his development and how he was growing up?
If we're looking at kids who are exceptionally gifted, their love for books is pretty obvious within just 3 or 4 months. But for Clark, almost as soon as he was born, he was just glued to books. So that was kind of the very first indicator that something was going on, just how observant he was. His ability to read was probably our biggest clue that something was different. I don't really know exactly when he started reading, but I remember it was my grandfather's birthday telling him about Clark reading out loud to me, and that would put Clark at about 16 months. So he's reading before he was 16 months old. And it was, it wasn't like scholarly articles, but it was, Dr. Seuss. I was a math teacher at the time, so I had Omi Inuye, I think is how you say her name, Introductory Calculus for Infants. That was one of his favorites. I don't know how much of that he actually grasped, but he really loved that book. So that was the biggest one up front. And then before he could even talk, he was able to demonstrate his understanding of basic shapes and numbers, letters, and even colors. Like he would point to objects in books as we named them and pick out colors to draw with by name before he could say the name of the color. He mastered kinder skills pretty well before he was 2. I mean, it's all relative, but before he was 2, he was saying his alphabet, and thanks to I love They Might Be Giant, so I have to give them props, but they have a song ZYX, 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 WVUT. So he memorized that song too. So he knew his alphabet forwards and backwards before, like right after he started talking, really. We knew really early on that learning was a need for him. It wasn't a want. Like if he wasn't learning, then it wasn't like he was unhappy, but he would sort of go into his own mind and entertain himself. Like if he wasn't stimulated by learning, he was seeking that stimulation elsewhere on his own, reading books, creating things in his mind. And that's something that eventually became a problem when he was in public school, because when he wasn't pushed, instead of acting out, he really just retreated into his own mind and was composing or...
Tell me a little bit about when you started noticing the interest in music.
He was about 1.5 years. It was his second Christmas. We got him a keyboard, and he just was attached to that thing. And we would watch Neil deGrasse Tyson's Cosmos, and he would go and play There was one scene where they're in a giant cathedral and Neil deGrasse Tyson starts playing keys in the organ, and then an organist comes in and starts playing Carmina Burana. And Clark just, the very first tune that I remember him playing by ear was dun, 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 dun. It wasn't a super complicated melody, but like he's almost 2, maybe a little over 2, and he's just able to pick that out. So he had a really early love for music. He picks it up. He would watch virtual sheet music online on YouTube, and that's one way he learned how to compose it. I had a little background in it, so I was able to teach him the very, very basic stuff. But he started composing when he was 2, and that's when he knew that he wanted to be a pianist and composer for the rest of his life. He has other interests, but he hasn't really wavered from that goal.
Yeah, that's been the thing.
When Clark was taking piano lessons before kinder, his piano teacher recommended that he take a test that's usually reserved for high school students and adults to show that they've mastered music theory. And he ended up taking that test actually toward the end of kinder, and he earned a distinguished rating on that. And at that point, he wanted to do more with music. So the only thing I could think of was to buy him the Barron's AP Music Theory book. So as a kinder kid, he started that book. For the most part, I was just reading it to him and not really fully understanding it, because he's got perfect pitch and he plays by ear and he can hear the music in his mind. I just can't. Like I played an instrument through high school and a little bit in college, but I can't hear it like he can. And we read through that. He went through all the exercises, and first grade year started, and he asked if he could take the AP Music Theory test. I didn't know.
Like, can you? I don't know.
So I reached out to the admin at the high school to see what that might look like. And he said he didn't know. So I reached out to College Board, and they said it is possible, but since he's under 13, he can't actually have a login. So there's this whole big process and all this red tape that we had to go through because he was underage. And we eventually got him set up to take that. And we had to hire a proctor because he was the only student in the district who was taking the AP Music Theory test. But, you know, he wanted to do it and he wanted to show that he learned it. So I did everything I could for him. And he took the test and we got the results back and he had scored a 5 on it.
Which, for those of people who don't know, an AP tests are scored on a score of 1 through 5. And typically colleges will accept sometimes a 3, but pretty generally a 4 or 5 for college credit.
Yep. So at this point, we had a 6-year-old with college credit, and I was at a loss for really what to do there. I started reaching out to friends that I knew were music majors, and I reached out to universities, like, what do I do next? Because obviously the next step would be college, and I was not capable of teaching him at that level. I barely held on through AP Music Theory. So we really lucked out. A friend of mine from college went to Texas State, and she connected us to Dr. Nico Schuler, who's a professor of piano composition and music theory there. And from the very first day they met, I feel like they were best friends. And I get choked up talking about Nico because he's part of the family now. He's been meeting with Clark weekly almost for the past 4.5, 5 years now, since right before COVID. And during COVID, he would meet with him in Zoom, and they really just talk about the music. And like Clark, really early on, went through the undergraduate music theory. By the time he was 8, Dr. Schuler was letting Clark audit his graduate theory classes. So Clark was in a class with, 48-year-old band directors who went back to school for their masters. And he was holding his own. He would bring up things from the first book that they read when they were having conversations about the next book, and like making all these connections and really contributing. And now they're writing, Dr. Schuler and Clark are collaborating on a research paper that they're going to present to, I guess, universities across the country about a German composer. It's like Henning Schrader, something like that Dr. Schuler loves. And I'm really excited about that. I think Clark is too.
More in a minute.
Since 1999, the Davidson Institute's goal has been to identify and recognize profoundly gifted youth and support them in a holistic way. Davidson learners are driven by their natural talent and abilities, not age, socioeconomic status, or location. You'll find programs like Young Scholars, which is free to profoundly gifted students and families, where they can connect with a community that understands them. The Davidson Fellow Scholarship, where gifted and high-achieving students who meet certain requirements are awarded $50,000, $25,000, and $10,000 scholarships. Davidson Explore is an online program for gifted middle school students to take a la carte courses in math, science, and the humanities. They even have gifted summer programs, including the Think Summer Institute. It offers gifted kids ages 8 to 16 a chance to be engaged academically and through community. And at the Davidson Academy in Reno and the Davidson Academy online, students are grouped by ability rather than age, offering a unique gifted high school experience. Davidson removes the ceiling that prevents so many students from getting the education they deserve. Find out more at davidsongifted.org or look for a link in the show notes. I know another thing that we hear about are these things that we think we know about the social and emotional development of gifted individuals, which sometimes I think are accurate and sometimes I think there are some myths. I think sometimes it gets conflated and misunderstood when you don't think about twice exceptional learners who are both gifted and have another diagnosis. So I'm curious about what you would say are some of the things that you've learned about regarding the differences in social and emotional needs of profoundly gifted children.
I don't know that I can speak for the majority of profoundly gifted kids, except when it comes to the idea of existential crises. I can talk about that in just a minute, but for Clark, really, socially and emotionally, he's always been really mature. And a lot of that comes, I think, from his profound ability to put himself in other kids' shoes, other people's shoes. He's an empath, maybe more than any other empath I've met. And that plays a big part in how he gets along with kids. He can talk to anyone, anywhere. He'll listen. He's very patient. Of course, if you let him, he will talk about things that go completely over your head, which is problematic in kindergarten. And, he'll talk to teachers and the teachers won't always know because they have mastery of the kindergarten and maybe first and second grade content that they're supposed to teach the students. But when he started kinder, we were doing algebra at home and the teacher wasn't really equipped to provide him with, algebra extensions when it was math time. She did the best she could, but that was not her role and arguably not even her responsibility at that point. And if I had known more, I would have pushed more for acceleration. I think my wife would have too. Our fear there, though, was that what's the point of accelerating him one grade when he's 5, 6, 9 grades ahead already?
Totally.
But with the friendship piece, he didn't really have trouble making friends, but were they really friends? Most kinder kids, they're not making friendships in the way that adults make friendships, where you have a commonality, you have something to talk about, you're engaged, and you have these experiences that you build over time with the friends. It's really more of, okay, you're sitting next to him, we're going to call them your friend. And
yep.
Clark at that point was already so developed that he really wanted more than that.
Mm-hmm.
He knew, I think, on some level what true friendship was. And he was not able to find those connections that he was really looking for with the kids. But they did play and they did have fun. Some of the time, because Clark was not engaged at school, he would go to recess and that was his moment to get ideas out and to have, time to focus on some of the things that he'd been thinking about throughout the morning. And he wouldn't always engage with the other kids. That may have gotten in the way of some of his friendships.
He wanted to talk about the things that he was thinking about and that were interesting.
Right.
And I'm sure that the other students probably, if they were tolerant of it, they didn't get it and they couldn't reciprocate and give anything back. Or they just were like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to go over here and run around and play kickball or whatever.
Exactly. But I do regret that I didn't ask his teacher in those moments where he maybe had taken a couple of days at recess to be alone. Like, if the point of us having him here is to develop socially and emotionally, then can you facilitate some of that a little bit more?
Yeah.
That would have been a step in the right direction, I think, for him.
Mm-hmm.
It was also like his chance to get a thought out and we weren't there. So, we didn't know about a lot of the things that were going on until it comes up in conversation years later. And he remembers his kinder and first grade years very clearly. And he still comes to us with things that he remembered. Oh, this happened. And I remember this kid, and he can name them all still and all that. But
wow.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more. You mentioned existential ideas or awareness. How would you describe that existential piece that sometimes we see in gifted kids, but it sounds like you see specifically in profoundly gifted kids even more?
I don't know about more necessarily, but definitely earlier, which is really awkward.
Yeah.
And really sad too, because nothing really prepares you for your 3 or 4-year-old coming down the stairs at 11:30 at night, unable to sleep, crying, distraught because they can't stop thinking about what's real and what might not be real. And it could be anything. Watch out, PG families, any gifted families. If you watch Cosmos, there are things in there that put ideas in kids' heads that they'll dwell on, like parallel universes or the concept of, am I living in a matrix kind of thing? And they will take that kind of thing to heart and dwell on it. So, we were dealing with things when he was 3 or 4, is there a parallel universe out there where our cat is still alive, so maybe I could see him again? Or, and these are through tears. What if there's nothing when you die, and what does nothingness feel like? What if I die in the middle of a composition that I'm writing and no one ever gets to hear the end of it? Feelings of, I have all these ideas that I'll never get to share. There's just not enough time to do all the things I want to do. And I think that that's a hallmark of profound giftedness, that those kinds of things happen, and they happen early. These are questions that a lot of adults never really dwell on or ask themselves.
I always find that when I'm working with or talking to families with gifted kids, like you mentioned, that trajectory, that asynchrony, it happens earlier. But I think one of the hardest things for kids experiencing those thoughts is that they don't have any life experience behind them, nor do they have really often the emotional regulation skills to kind of process all of that. Their brain might be advanced in a lot of ways, but it's still developing.
Right.
An adult can kind of put things into perspective, in some ways. And it's like, okay, well, this is my life, or this is what I've experienced, and, whatever. But when you've only lived 6 or 7 years, maybe,
yeah,
it's really hard.
I feel like the best thing that we were able to do for him was just to be his anchor, just hold him and ground him and let him know that through hugging him, that we are real. Just the feeling of closeness and the feeling of physical contact, I think went a long way. Brushing up on philosophy probably helps too, to an extent, because he wants to know your thoughts on these things too.
Yeah.
Something that helps him now, because he doesn't really have existential crises like he used to anymore. We're ready for them if they do come up, but just knowing that he's constantly learning. For the example I used earlier, am I the only thing that's real? If I am the only thing that's real, how am I learning new things? Am I teaching myself the things that I don't know about personally? How is that possible? So that's paradoxical. And he can rationalize some of these things, but we don't lie to him. We don't make things up, just to
for comfort or
make him feel better, to comfort him in the moment. We're honest and tell him that there are questions that no one has answers to.
Well, it doesn't make any sense to simply appease somebody in the moment who's dealing with that. You have to kind of face it head on.
Yep.
I don't know if we've mentioned it specifically, but in case anyone hasn't picked up on it, Clark is homeschooled.
Yeah.
The educational system wasn't really meeting his needs. How would you say your understanding of education and gifted education and supporting learners has changed because of your experiences as a parent of a profoundly gifted child?
I would say the primary thing is that I've done a lot more research into acceleration and different ways to accelerate. And there's a dearth of over 40 years of research supporting that. My favorite go-to is the Bell and Blank Center's Acceleration Institute. And I'm able to share my story with families and reassure them somewhat that the social and emotional needs tend to be fine as the students accelerate at a grade level, sometimes more.
Yeah.
In my own work, as Clark was in school, I was trying to fix things that I noticed. I wasn't even the full GT person at the time. I was slowly taking on the role. So, and it was a specialist position. It wasn't a coordinator position, but it ended up being all the things that a coordinator would do. It was a small district. So that's just kind of the way things go. But as I fixed things, he was already so far beyond the things that I fixed that it didn't benefit him.
Yeah.
But it would benefit the next Clark or the next highly gifted kid who came around. Like I pushed so hard to get GT teachers at the elementary level, and that happened after we had pulled him, improved resources, created more resources. I had more training for the teachers. Teacher training, like teachers know, they have a pretty good concept of what gifted and talented looks like. Those kiddos who are around the 130, 125 range that you mentioned earlier, because those are the bulk of your GT kids.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them had never heard of a kid like Clark, but just spreading that awareness that kids like that are out there and then what to do for them.
Mm-hmm.
I keep that in my pocket at all times.
Just to put it in perspective, back when I taught in gifted education, I actually taught in a program for exceptionally gifted students, and our criteria was a 145 or above. That was kind of the benchmark, and then there were some other hoops to jump through for what it's worth. But I had a mixed grade classroom of second and third graders, and in a school district of close to 20,000 students, I had 7, which really kind of, it makes sense, but it's extremely rare. And it was so interesting because even in that classroom, they were all so different and had such varied needs in a variety of ways. But it was cool how we could just progress really quickly and really focus on the things they were interested in because they were so engaged and because they could check the boxes quickly and then move on to their areas of passion.
Yeah.
It was a room full of asynchrony.
And I love that you're laughing, thinking back to it, because that would be the vibe I would get too. Just controlled chaos in a lot of ways. And
I could talk about it, between the child who was a perfectionist, and ultimately I ended up taking away his erasers from him because he would just sit and erase, to the child who would crawl around on the floor acting like a spy, while we're trying to do other things, to, some of the anxiety with some of the negative self. Like there were so many things. I think probably the oddest thing about that experience for those students was that they then stayed together essentially all the way through high school. It wasn't just friendship relationships. It was like sibling relationships with some of that
right.
bickering and the back and forth, but also just knowing each other really, really well. But those are few and far between. And
in a small district like we were in, there just wasn't a big enough cohort to justify pulling them through a track like that.
It's hard to figure out how to support kids. I mean, I think the bottom line is also, it's like, what does that even look like? There's no standard because it's so rare. They don't know where to go with it. Like they don't even know what the starting point is. And so I can understand that, but from the family and the child's perspective, they deserve that education.
Absolutely.
Another question for you about Clark and just kind of your experience in talking about homeschooling and everything else. I often hear people who ask like, well, are you worried about him having a normal childhood? Which I think I probably know what your answer is, but I'm curious how, I don't know, maybe it's a worry that you have had in the past yourself and maybe reconciled or not. I don't know.
I mean, it's a chicken and the egg kind of question, right?
Right.
He's just not quote unquote normal. Really, none of us are normal. And that's
right.
That should be that person's main takeaway. But just like a lot of other gifted homeschoolers, and there are a lot of us out there, they don't homeschool to make their kids different. They homeschool because their kids are different. And society doesn't have systems in place to support their difference. Even people at gifted conferences will ask me, do you think you're pushing him too hard? Do you think he needs to be at school so he can make friends? Do you feel like you're making the right decisions for him? And they have these barrage of questions. And I know that they're really just trying to feel out what's going on in this unique situation. And they're not asking to be hurtful. I just have to take a breath and I have to remind them that it's not us who are pushing Clark. He's pulling us. And it's always been that way. We try to facilitate as best as we can, and then we just get out of the way. And I think it's the same for every other PG family out there. Mm-hmm. Nobody chooses to go at this pace. The pace chooses you, and not even the PG kids. The PG kids don't choose to go at this pace. They can't help the way that they learn. They just learn quickly and master things quickly. And that's just the bottom line. They're hungry for more.
Blake, I'm so grateful for your time today and sharing your experiences. As we wrap up our conversation, this brings me to my last question. If you were talking to a parent who has just realized or is beginning to realize and is on the path of raising a profoundly gifted child, what would you tell them?
Don't let people tell you that there's a such thing as too fast. And if that's their takeaway on what you're telling them about your kid, then they really miss the point. Like I said earlier, nobody picks this pace. The PG kids themselves don't pick the pace. So as a society, we just really need to get out of their way and let them learn and not put limits on our kids.
Blake Haygood, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Emily. It was a pleasure.
It can be hard for us to imagine what it must be like to be the parent or educator of a profoundly gifted child, or to be profoundly gifted yourself. Profound giftedness is extremely rare. Only 13 out of every 10,000 people have an IQ that measures over 154. I taught in a program for exceptionally gifted children, and I work within the gifted community, and the number of profoundly gifted children and teens that I have met is less than what I can count on two hands. The music you're hearing now is again by Clark Haygood. The opportunities available for children like this frequently must be created by those around them, because our educational system just isn't cut out to support those who learn in such a different way than their peers. Answers for neurodivergent learners are hard to find, but as always, finding a sense of community with others experiencing similar lives can be helpful, like Blake and his wife have found with a group of other families of profoundly gifted children. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thanks to our sponsor, Davidson Institute. For information about them, go to davidsongifted.org. Also thanks to Blake Haygood and his super talented son Clark, who contributed by kicking in much of the music you've heard on this episode, including what you're hearing now. This kiddo is really talented, my goodness. There are links to everything in the show notes. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media director is Krista Brown. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris, and for all of us, thank you for listening. And we will see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.